Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to True Crime Wednesday. I'm Lori Hellis. I'm a retired criminal defense and did prosecution too, criminal attorney. And I have written the definitive book. It's right up here and whoops, down there. It's always so confusing because this is opposite what do you think it should be. Written the definitive book on the Ballard Daybell case. So we're going to talk about, we have so much to talk about tonight. I don't know if I can get it all in 2 hours, so brace yourself. While we are waiting for folks to join the stream, though, I wanted to talk about a few little housekeeping things. First of all, I know that when the whole thing happened with the challenge to the indictment in the Daybell case, everybody was wanting to know why we weren't on and talking about it. And so I think it's important to remember that we don't really do breaking news. We do analysis. And so if you're looking for the why something happened, I'm your girl. But we don't necessarily break it as it happens. We do some surprise lives, as you all know, if there's something important to talk about and that really warrants some a little bit more in-depth analysis. So I've had some questions about other cases. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the other cases and what may happen after the Daybell case is over with. I'm very interested in the Karen Reed case. I know it's going on at the same time. It is a fascinating case, and I am hoping that it may still be going on when we have the opportunity, when the Daybell case is with the jury and maybe after deliberations. So we will continue to talk about that. We also had a development in the Corey Richens case. Corey Richens' attorneys, her team of attorneys, who are very good and very well known, asked to withdraw. Now, a lot of people speculated that this was because Corey was out of money, and it may be in part. But if you look at the motions that were filed, something came up in her civil cases that made them feel like they had an ethical obligation to withdraw. So it raised some sort of actual conflict or some sort of issue with the defense not being able to present her for some reason. Oftentimes what that is they are aware that she is not being truthful with the tribunal, with the court. And it absolutely cannot happen that a lawyer would knowingly allow a client to make false statements to the court. So something is up there, something a little fishier than just she's out of money. So, and yes, I will be following that, but right now we are heavily focused on the Daybell case. Some of you have gotten notices from Amazon because our release date has been moving around a little bit. So I want to address that for people who might have questions. If you've pre-ordered the book, you may have gotten a notice from Amazon. So the first thing that happened was that my publisher uploaded to Amazon their entire fall catalog, which includes our book. My book was had already been uploaded to Amazon for pre-orders because we wanted to have it available before I went to CrimeCon for the pre-orders. And but what happened was when they uploaded their entire catalog a week or so ago, it automatically updated all of the release dates to the 1st of October. So my publisher went back and corrected that. Once we realized that people were getting those notices, the publisher went back and corrected that. However, we are bumping up against some really important hard deadlines, having to do with when the book is going to be actually sent to the printer. And that's a deadline that doesn't have a lot of wiggle room to it. If it's not in by this date, it will not release for September 3rd. So I am walking a tightrope with the Daybell trial, because the very last chapter in the book involves the Daybell trial, Chad's trial. And I really want to be able to finish that chapter and include it in the book. So, we're kind of cutting it very close. We are not sure at this point whether we may have to slip the date by a couple of weeks, the release date. That really depends on the Chad trial. Now, I promised my publisher that the minute the Chad trial is done, we have a verdict and we have a sentence, the book will be available to go to the printer. So it all really sort of hinges on how soon Chad's trial is going to be done. So stick with me here, because we're going to get it to the printer at the absolute soonest date. There are 106 people who joined the book launch team, and those folks will get an advanced copy. So once the book is the final edit is done, you will get the PDF that will go to the printer. And what we're asking for in return is that you post a review as soon as the release date comes and Amazon allows it, because they won't allow you to post until the release date. And the last question, I had a few questions about my move. Yes, I am moving. We have closed on a house in Central Oregon in Redmond, which is just the town next door to Bend, where I spent 20 years practicing and my daughter grew up. My daughter and her husband are planning a move to Bend as well. We're not quite sure when that move will happen for them. They're working out job issues, but that is their plan. And the house that I've been living in Idaho has sold. And so we will be closing on that one and moving. The first couple weeks in July is when the move will happen. We arranged to have a later closing on our Idaho house, and the house in Redmond won't be ready and available until then. So thanks for asking, everybody. We packed up a lot of stuff when we were getting the house ready to show, and we'll be finishing that up as the next month or so goes by. I am officially 8 days away from CrimeCon. I leave for Nashville a week from tomorrow. So we have one more True Crime Wednesday before I will be heading out for Nashville. My daughter's going to show up and join me and help me man the table. And anybody else who's going to be at CrimeCon and wants to do a couple of hours at my table in the creator row, let me know. We'd welcome some help. And so other than that, things are going well. I've got our display stuff and our swag all ready to take down with me. And things are moving along. But what we need to talk about most today, I have one more thing I wanted to mention. I met this woman, her name is Tracy Atsuka. She is a podcaster who does a podcaster on women with ADHD. And she recently interviewed me. And the interview is up on her podcast. So I've asked Jen to drop it in our chat, And we'll also drop it in our show notes so that you'll be able to take a look at that if that's something that interests you. And let's talk about Daybell. So Monday morning, bright and early, the defense took over and began to present their case in chief. Now, I had great plans to go down and attend in person at the courthouse. I got there a couple of minutes after 7, and there were already well more than 100 people in line. It is the first time I have seen that kind of a line at either trial. Now, Lori's trial, we had a registration system, so you didn't really line up if you didn't have a ticket. And the ticket was for the 65 places in the courtroom as well as the overflow room. So when I got there, they were already talking about opening an overflow room, which I thought was sort of silly for me to go and sit in an overflow room and watch a video when I could sit at home and do it. So I called it a morning, went and got some coffee and came home. So I have not been back down to the courthouse. We really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So we'll get into that as we go along. But Monday was the day that we heard from the first defense witnesses. So here's how I want to approach this today, this afternoon, this evening. First, I would like to kind of quickly do a little recap of the witnesses that John Pryor put on. And then I went through the last week's chat because we had something like 30 questions that didn't get answered. So I went through last week's chat and your comments from YouTube and assembled some questions that I'm then going to go through. If once we have answered all of last week's questions, you still have questions that we haven't addressed, we'll get to those. So let me just start out with the recap. Chad, the first witness that was invited to testify for the defense was Chad's daughter, Emma. Now, we've seen Emma on a couple of interviews that she did. There were a lot of remarks about her appearance, and I don't really like to comment on people's appearance all that much. However, several of the witnesses that we have seen have made major changes to their appearance, and this one is particularly interesting, I guess. When we first met Emma, she had short, pixie cut, dark hair, which we saw sort of grow out a little bit over the time when she did the interview with, I think it was 2020, but it may have been Dateline. I keep getting them mixed up. We saw her at trial. Her hair is probably the length of mine, a little hard to tell because she had it kind of pulled back. And it's blonde, like light blonde. Some people were noticing that her photograph from her school staff picture, because she's a school teacher, sort of looked like Elsa. She had it braided and sort of around to one side, and commented that she is beginning to look a lot more like Lori Vallow than like her mother, which I thought was kind of sad. So there have been those comments. I don't think we had a lot of unexpected testimony from Emma. As we expected, she testified that her health was declining, that she was having some health problems, that she didn't like to go to the doctor. I mean, she really was following Chad's script. that she used holistic remedies, and that she Emma saw her struggling, trying to carry some heavy boxes at school the day that she died, because Emma helped her move the boxes. Emma sort of talked about the fact, and the prosecution made a lot of the fact that Tammy was busy. She walked around the school all day. She took classes back and forth to class. Emma made the point that the school is small, that she wasn't walking as great a distance as someone might think. One of the things Emma did say is that she and Tammy had been doing the fitness classes and the clogging classes. She maintained that they had not been doing them that long. Other people said she'd been doing the Zumba high intensity fitness class for quite a while. Emma said she thought they'd been doing the clogging class about 6 weeks when Tammy died. One of the things Emma said was that it was not, Tammy was not training to run a 5K race, which is about 3 miles. It's not a huge distance. The race was organized by Emma's husband, Joe Murray, as a fundraiser, ironically enough, for Tim Ballard's Operation Underground Railroad, which Tim Ballard is no longer associated with. They've given him the heave-ho. And that Tammy was a race volunteer. This came out in both Emma and Joseph Murray's testimony, that Tammy was a race volunteer, and she may have walked across the finish line because there was a group of people who were encouraging some people to walk, who were sort of the end of the race, to make it across the finish line. So people may have seen her walk across the finish line, but she was not a registered participant. And Emma said when she invited Tammy to run, Tammy said there was no way she would run. So we don't know who's actually telling the truth. It may very well be that Tammy was a race volunteer. It was like her to volunteer for things and to help out with things. So it may have been that she was a race volunteer. Nonetheless, there are a lot of people who say that Tammy was not ailing. She seemed healthy, and there's a lot of evidence, including from Chad's own mother, that Tammy seemed fine. So, but it wasn't unexpected for her to follow the company line. She also testified that John Pryor asked her about whether her LDS beliefs were more mainstream. She sort of said they were, but she also said that that there were times when Tammy used her emotion code, body coding skills to help cast out or rid her of bad emotions and those sorts of things. She testified that at one point there was she has suffered with anxiety. At one point, she said she felt like there was an entity following her around, and she asked Tammy for help in casting that out. And they did use the word casting. So there was that. So the hi, Trisha the trucker. I hope we're going to see you in Nashville next week. She just posted something that said hi from Nashville. And I caught it out of the corner of my eye in the chat. I try not to watch the chat because I get too distracted doing it. So back to Emma. Emma seemed to be saying that she was more mainstream in her beliefs, and that Tammy and Chad were definitely more fundamentalist. But she also admitted that there were times when she asked her mother to help her by using her muscle testing and body coding and those sorts of things. So I don't know that there were any huge surprises in Emma's testimony. I think that she testified that Tammy Daybell had a Fitbit and that she was in competition with Joe Murray's, her in-laws, for who could take the most steps. And so Tammy would sometimes wear her Fitbit and shake her arm to make it seem like she'd taken more steps than she had. So all in all, I thought her testimony was pretty predictable, and definitely minimized an awful lot of tried to minimize and maybe justify some of the things that were testified to during the prosecution's case. So the next person who came up was Garth. Now, I thought Garth's testimony was probably a little bit more of things we had not heard before, and so a little more interesting or a little more enlightening in that way. First of all, I thought he and Emma were both very unemotional. When John Pryor got into talking about the day that Tammy died, he said, "I don't want to belabor this, but I need to talk to you about these things. Please let me know if you need a break or you need a Kleenex or you need some water." And she said, "No, I'm fine." And she was extremely unemotional during the whole thing. And I felt like Garth was a little bit unemotional as well. Garth has a really strange inflection to his voice. He's one of those people who ends every sentence kind of on the up, like he's asking a question. And it's a little, I don't know. It sounds a little bit sing-song and maybe a little bit like he's unsure of himself. It kind of comes across that way. So John Pryor asked him about, he asked him about raccoons. And so Garth told him that there had been times, but he couldn't really nail down when they had been bothered by raccoons getting into their rabbit hutches, eating the rabbit food. They were afraid they were going to attack the rabbits. And so they went after Chad and Garth. Both were looking to rid themselves of raccoons. At one point, he said they borrowed a trap from their neighbor, but the trap wasn't really big enough to catch the big fat raccoon that they had there. And ultimately, he said he was testing a new tent. And so he had it set up in the backyard at night and discovered that the marauding raccoon was in the backyard, and Chad came out with his shotgun and shot it. And what was interesting was Garth said animals like that were not buried in the pet cemetery. They were buried behind the silver shed, or they were thrown in the compost heap, and that there were several raccoons in the compost heap. He said, he also said that he was concerned about Tammy. He did not really get as detailed about Tammy having health problems. At one point, he said she found it hard to catch her breath after she had been working hard in the garden, and usually she used him as her muscle. Well, who wouldn't? The other thing he said was that sometimes when she got up off her knees, she would be lightheaded or that she had fainting spells. So most people know this, but it's important to point out that women who are menopausal or maybe postmenopausal sometimes have that, and I'm sure the medical people in the chat will post the exact term for it, but often what happens is your blood pressure drops when you stand up fast or you exert yourself and then stand up. And so that happens often. I just had somebody I noticed in the chat say that they, hypotension, thank you, Jill. Somebody say that they felt that Emma lied about the internet search, where who searched for South by Southwest winds or whatever it was. I don't know that that's really super significant. There we go. Thank you, Polio. I didn't know that that was super significant, and it really did sound inauthentic when she said it. So I don't know what the jury will make of that. So back to Garth. Probably the most significant thing we found out was, if you recall, a year or so after the grand jury first met, the grand jury, they reconvened the grand jury for about a week. And of course, because grand jury proceedings are sealed, we had no idea what that was about, whether or not they were trying to bring additional charges, whether or not they were trying to or had questions about charging someone else. So we didn't know. But we found out when Garth testified that the grand jury had questions for him. Now, according to him, he was called in front of the grand jury and pressured to change his testimony. I don't know if that was true or not, but I do think that they said to him, it is possible that you could be charged with perjury for changing your story. It will be interesting to see whether anything comes of that after Chad's trial is done and he has testified in the trial. It'll be interesting to see whether anything else comes of that. I think it's possible. He also said that he is much more mainstream than his mom and his dad. He said he teaches evolution he's an 8th grade science teacher, and he teaches evolution. And he definitely gave the impression that that he is not as fundamentalist as his parents. The next person was Forrest Fisher. This was weird, to me at least. This is the attorney from the public defender that was assigned to represent Garth at this grand jury, where he supposedly was threatened with perjury. Now, this guy didn't have a lot of recollection about what was going on. He didn't know for certain what happened inside the grand jury because he could not appear with Garth. So he sat outside to be there to answer questions if Garth had questions. He wasn't sure whether this was the same grand jury panel or not. I believe it was, because it was the original grand jury that had questions, the original panel. He said that Garth told him he was pressured to change his testimony, and the grand jury was asking about perjury. I think this is an issue John Pryor is actually trying to set up on appeal. I think John Pryor has a problem with the grand jury And of course, once again, we don't know what happened in the grand jury, but John Pryor filed motions to dismiss the grand jury, the indictment, to challenge the grand jury. And I think this is just another way of attacking that grand jury process. Because if you can attack the underlying indictment and the underlying grand jury, then you end up not having to appeal any of the rest of the trial. Because if the initial grand jury and the charging document are wrong, the trial gets thrown out and you get a new trial, or you get a thrown out indictment. So that, I think, is where John Pryor's trying to go. Joseph Murray was the next witness. He is Emma's husband. He testified they've been married 7 years. They have 3 children now, including a newborn. So I didn't know that. He testified that Chad gave Emma $9,000 in cash and gave them $8,000 and their Dodge truck. He says the first time he met Lori Vallow, and this was, I guess, not surprising, but just hard to hear. The first time he met Lori Vallow was the day after Tammy Daybell's funeral at Chad Daybell's house. Now, we had been told that after the funeral, or I think after the Rexburg Memorial, that they all went to Lori's for cookies, but we did not know that she was at Chad Daybell's house the day after Tammy's funeral. And that just feels really disrespectful and sad. Joseph Murray also mentioned something about seeing Detective Hermosillo on Facebook. And I know that there was a Facebook group that a lot of law enforcement, some of the judges, some of the court staff were in. It was a county employee website or a Facebook group. And that there were people commenting on the evidence before anybody was indicted, any charges were brought. So when the children were missing, before they ever even brought Lori back from Hawaii. And I thought it was also interesting that John Pryor asked Joseph Murray, "You're not a law enforcement officer, are you?" And he said, "I would rather choose any other profession." So that sort of tells you where his mind is at. He confirmed that Chad gave each of his 4 children $8,000 from the money from Tammy's insurance. So the next person was John Pryor's first expert witness. This was Dr. Kathy Raven, and she is a forensic pathologist and a contract forensic doctor in California. She said she testified 300 plus times. I have no fault with the way she testified. She was very polished and very practiced. She reviewed the coroner's report and the medical examiner's report of Tammy Daybell's autopsy. And she said there was no anatomical cause of death and no toxicological cause of death. She says she believes that the cause of death should not have been homicide, that it should have been undetermined. She says the bruising that she saw was non-specific. So and the autopsy didn't, because it was non-specific, didn't support the conclusion of asphyxia. Now, here's the really interesting thing. Lindsay Blake then went through and asked her, did you review the interviews with? And she went through the whole litany of reports and interviews, like 20 different names of reports and interviews that the medical examiner in Utah did review, that this doctor did not review. The other thing that she didn't do is they never talked about the pulmonary edema. If you recall, there were multiple reports, both from Chad and Garth and from Brenda Dye and from the medical examiner who did the autopsy, that Tammy had bloody foam in her lungs and coming out of her mouth. And that sort of pink-tinged bloody foam is indicative of pulmonary edema. And pulmonary edema, which is swelling in the and fluid in the lungs, is caused by asphyxiation. So Dr. Raven did not mention that. And Lindsay Blake did not bring it up on cross-examination. Now, either it's going to come up on rebuttal, or she's just going to argue it, which might be the better course, to say nothing and just argue. You know, this medical examiner didn't even address the cause of death that the Utah medical examiner identified. Now, the medical examiner who examined Tammy's body after she was exhumed said there was still evidence of that bloody foam in her lungs, even after she'd been embalmed. Likewise, the physician, the Dr. Raven, the defense expert, didn't see any problem with, didn't see any problem at all with the toxicology, what had been requested, how long it took, or any of those other issues. She explained that when you test for something, as we've talked about before, you have to test for a specific agent or a specific element in the body. And so it wouldn't be unusual for them to say things like, these all came back negative, let's test the next level of rarity. So they would start with the most common things. If those were negative, they'd go to the next tier. If those are negative, they'd go to the more exotic sorts of causes. And so, and all of those tests were negative. So Dr. Raven didn't review Tammy Daybell's medical records, and Lindsay Blake went down this very long list of people that were interviewed and records that were reviewed before Dr. Christensen issued his findings. So it was really good cross. If you haven't watched it and want to go and watch it, Lindsay did a really good job. Now, I do want to say something about Lindsay. We know that during the last trial, she had a death in her family. Her father, who had dementia, died suddenly, unexpectedly, the first week of trial. She had to go back and help her family with arrangements for him, go to his funeral. And I'm certain that that had an impact on her. She came back and like most lawyers, compartmentalized it and came back and buckled down and did her job. But I am certain it was not easy, and she may not have been at her absolute best. But I'm going to tell you, she is at her absolute best in this trial. She has been right on. She is very clear. She is leading the defense. And it's really interesting, the choices that she's made for who does what cross. She cross-examined Emma. She has a little bit more of a conversational style and a little less confrontational than some defense attorneys. She was firm, but I thought she took just the right tone with Emma. So that I thought she did a really good job. The next person that John Pryor called was Regan Price. She was Chad's Daybell's neighbor directly across the street. It was they who loaned the Daybells and the Murrays the raccoon trap, the animal trap. So, and she's Chad's neighbor across the street. So apparently she had reported to law enforcement that she had some concerns about things going on in the Daybell property. They didn't really get into it because she couldn't remember the specific dates. And she said she had reported that she heard a gunshot over there, but once again, couldn't remember when. So we don't know if there was a gunshot the day that she was, that supposedly Chad killed the raccoon. We don't know any of those things because she didn't remember. Now, you know, in her defense, it is 4.5 years ago. But she didn't remember. And so she wasn't of a lot of use to John Pryor. And she did say that she met with the police and even offered to wear a wire and talk to the Murrays. And they declined. Now, at this point, the judge said he had received at sidebar some information about a correction that the prosecution wanted to make to some earlier information. And so they did not reopen the prosecution case, but Rocky Wixom got up and said that while he was going through some of the police reports in preparation for cross-examination, he realized that when Heather Daybell testified, she was asked about her relation to Dave Hope, who is an officer with, I think he's a detective with the Rexburg Police Department. And she was asked because Dave Hope is her daughter's father-in-law. Now, Heather testified that they're not particularly close to Dave Hope and his wife, that they see them at family events like, you know, babies and weddings and those sorts of things, baby blessings, but they don't socialize with them. And what Wixom wanted to point out to the court was that Heather said that she had never met with Dave Hope. She actually did do an interview, a professional interview with Dave Hope. And he wanted to make that clear that she had been interviewed by Dave Hope about the case, but that she had not had any conversations with him other than that professional contact. And the judge asked whether the defense had any concern. Pryor said he had absolutely no concern, and it really was a non-issue. But it is always important for a lawyer to clarify things because we have a responsibility of candor to the court, to the tribunal. So it was the right thing for him to do, to bring that to the attention of the court and let the defense have an opportunity to address it. So the next witness was Asmir Kararik, he pronounced it. It was, it was interesting how the judge, John Pryor, sort of said Kararik, and when he was asked how to pronounce his name, when the judge asked him, he said it was Kararik. He does have a little bit of an accent, and it definitely rolled his R's. He was the investigator for the Attorney General's office. Now, let's drop back a little bit. Originally, when the investigation was underway, the Fremont County District Attorney, Marcia Murdoch, who was Lindsay Blake's predecessor, felt that they did not have the resources to investigate Tammy Daybell's case, because at that point the children's bodies had not been found. This was purely Rexburg, because Lori and the children lived in Rexburg. Madison County was and Rexburg PD were in charge of the investigation into the kids, and Fremont County was in charge of Tammy Daybell's investigation. So the DA, or the prosecutor in Fremont County, said to the AG, I don't believe our small county has the resources to investigate this case, and asked the AG to take it over. That happens in small rural communities. So, but after the children's bodies were found and Lindsay Blake had been elected into the prosecutor's office, she asked for the case to come back to her. So they took the case back. That was the point at which Asmir was no longer on the case. But this was a little bit interesting and maybe a little juicy, but pointless in terms of the case. And I'm not really sure why John Pryor put him on. However, what he said was Asmir interviewed Melanie Gibb. And during that conversation, Melanie Gibb told him that she could tell who was dark and who was light. And Melanie Gibb said, you seem like a really nice guy. I think you're light. So, interesting, because Melanie had testified, I think, that she got all of that information from Chad and Lori. So I think that was the whole purpose of putting that information on the record. But it really, from a trial standpoint, it really had very little impact on the case. Now, it does give John Pryor more to argue about Melanie being a liar and not being reliable. So in that regard, I think in his closing arguments, he'll be able to argue she was unreliable. So the next person was Rick Schmidt. They brought up at sidebar an issue with the exclusionary rule, and the reason was that Rick Schmidt, he testified at Lori Vallow's trial about June 9th, when the children were found. I mean, it was a little foolish. He was asked about whether or not he'd been watching any of the trial. He said no, although some kind of news was on when he walked into the room that his wife was listening to, and it was the comment that the realtor made to John Pryor about, you now own the property, you must know how much it's, or how many acres there are. What John Pryor was trying to get in was that when this police officer got to the scene where the FBI was organizing the search, he was given a shovel, and according to John Pryor, the officer was given a shovel and told, go find stuff. which doesn't sound like a very organized or very systematic way of mapping out the scene. He then clarified and said, well, that was early when I got there, and we were told to go around and look for any areas of suspicion. He wasn't necessarily handed a shovel and told, go dig up stuff. So all in all, I thought that was a fairly pointless witness, because I don't think John Pryor got what he wanted out of it, which is to call the investigation into question, to say, oh, the FBI was sloppy in the way that they did the recovery. And I just don't, that's not going to fly. So the person that we saw today was Patrick Eller. Now, he's a forensic data analyst, and he's got some pretty good bona fides. And he made some points. I think they made a few points on the CAS data. One of the things he said was that they did the geofence, and that there were other devices that were caught in the geofence. Now, a geofence is where you say, I want to know every cell phone that activated on the towers in this area, that talked to the towers in this area that were close to Chad Daybell's property during this period of time. So that's called geofencing. So what then Google does, if you're using Google GPS location, what they do is they then look at everything that pinged on those towers. They then give law enforcement a list. That list only includes an ID number that Google assigns to each user. It is an anonymous, unique identifier. Then what happens is law enforcement compares that to the other records in their investigation. For example, they would want to know, did any of these numbers text Alex Cox, or text Lori Vallow, or text Chad Daybell? And then they would sort of work backwards to make sure that they have all of those phones. And then they would also look at when the connection happened, when they were there, all of those things. And they would select from that list any other phones that they wanted to know user information on. Now, what Patrick Eller said was that he had never heard of Google limiting the number of entries, the number of devices that you could get information from. But the CAST folks testified that Google limited them to only 10 numbers that they could get the actual user, find out actually who the user was on those devices. So so that was, he said there were 19 devices that appeared within 10 meters or less of the reference point, which was the Daybell property. So 10 meters is 30 feet, which is easily, they could be on the roads that run on two sides of Chad's property, or at a neighbor's. So but they did make a point of the fact that law enforcement did not identify every one of those users. The other thing they said was that they couldn't place Chad on his property at the important times. Now, John Pryor is going to argue Chad wasn't there and that it was Lori and Alex who did all the dirty work. But it's just as likely that Chad turned his phone off. So that once again was interesting that the prosecution did not argue that, because I think it would have given John Pryor the opportunity to counter that. So they didn't raise it. I think it will come up either in, certainly will come up in argument, and will likely come up in rebuttal. So, because I think they just had to be champing at the bit to cross him. But I think they are going to reserve those things for argument. So the last witness today, and the last witness so far, and I think he is the last witness for the defense, was Dr. Greg Hampikian. Now, Dr. Hampikian, first of all, he looks like a defense witness. He's got long gray hair and a beard, like shoulder-length gray hair and a beard. He just looks like a defense witness. He is a professor. He's a really smart guy. He teaches biology and criminal justice at Boise State University here in Boise. He also teaches at the law school. But what he is an expert on is DNA, and he actually teaches students how to get DNA lab results. So he has worked extensively on cases of wrongful conviction, like the Innocence Project. He didn't specifically name the Innocence Project, but he said he does DNA review for cold cases. There were several times during the time that John Pryor was talking about his qualifications as an expert that the prosecution objected that he was trying to bolster the witness. What that means is he's trying to vouch for the witness's credibility. So, and you can't do that. You can elicit testimony from somebody about their qualifications, about what they saw, about what they've done, but you can't do things to make them more credible and bolster their credibility. So there was some discussion about the DNA that, first of all, John Pryor went through this very laborious questions about how DNA is transferred, and it can be touch DNA, it can be in the air, it can be in your breath. He went through this very tortured description to get to the point of saying, we don't know how DNA gets to a certain place. Expert agreed. The DNA expert for the prosecution probably would agree too. Then he went on to talk about the hairs that were found in the duct tape, and made the point, which I thought he should have made on cross a long time ago, that hair is the easiest thing to shed, and it is the easiest thing to transfer. And so he sort of discounted Lori's hair being on things. He did point out that there were several dark hairs, and not all of them were identified. And it wasn't really clear whether he was saying they didn't need to be identified, because some of them were sent to Bodie Labs, which is the lab that can do hair analysis for hair that doesn't have a root, that doesn't have DNA, skin DNA. So he also went into the fact that there wasn't any proof of how Tylee's DNA got on the tools in Chad's shed. I mean, he sort of worked through all of that to make the point that you can't know for sure how someone's DNA got on tools in Chad's shed. But the jury has to make that that is circumstantial evidence, and it's the jury that has to connect those dots. And there was no evidence that would suggest an alternative explanation for how Tylee's DNA got on those tools. So I thought Dr. Hampikian is very qualified and probably he's very good at testifying, and I think he probably does a very good job for people who can be exonerated by DNA. But I don't really think that he did an awful lot to help out the defense in this case. The DNA kind of speaks for itself. And as he said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that little adage often comes up in trials, that just because you don't have evidence that something happened doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means there's an absence of evidence. That came up and in sort of the idea of that you can find evidence that could link somebody to, say, the tools. But I thought it was interesting because I think the prosecution is going to be able to turn that around and say, this is exactly the case here. Just because there isn't a complete causal chain doesn't mean it didn't happen, and doesn't mean that you can find that it didn't happen. It's not reasonable doubt. The absence of evidence is not reasonable doubt. So that was the end of today. That was the end so far of the defense's case in chief. I think Dr. Hampikian was the last witness, and here's why I say that. We had yet another instance today of the judge wanting to have conversations with the jury. So if you remember, after the prosecution rested, the judge said to the jury, you're not released yet because I want you to go to the jury room and have a conversation with the jury commissioner about what's coming up. That really was about what happens once the defense rests, once the prosecution rests. So the prosecution rested. They had a day off on Friday. Monday, John Pryor comes in and starts calling witnesses. This afternoon, the judge said he dismissed the public but kept the jury and the lawyers to discuss scheduling. That very likely, in my mind, means the defense is going to rest. And that the judge is giving the jurors some heads up on what happens next. Now, the judge is not required to sequester the jury for the innocence and guilt phase, but the law does require that the jury be sequestered for the penalty phase. So here is my prediction, and I'm just going to go out on a limb and look into my smoky crystal ball and give you a couple of predictions about what I think is going to be coming up. I think that tomorrow we're going to hear from John Pryor that he's resting. And that means that the state still has the opportunity to present any rebuttal witnesses, which is why they did not release any of their law enforcement people from their subpoenas. Rebuttal testimony, let's remember that rebuttal testimony has to be testimony that rebuts what the defense put on. So the prosecution can't go back and retry their whole case. What they can do is put on rebuttal testimony to address things that came up in the defense's case in chief. So that is not going to be a lengthy process. You might have 1 or 2 rebuttal witnesses. And I think the next thing that happens is that the judge is going to give the jury their jury instructions. Now, death penalty case, there are going to be a lot of jury instructions. It is going to take a while, probably a couple of hours for the judge to instruct the jury. Once that happens, then they'll be free to do closing arguments. So if I had to guess, defense is going to rest tomorrow. Prosecution is going to put on any rebuttal witnesses, and we're going to get closing arguments on Friday. Yeah. East Idaho News left the stream on. It was at the end of the live stream. They came back, but didn't let the public back in. Okay. Pryor said he was ready to rest, and the state was arguing over what rebuttal witnesses will be called. Okay, so that makes sense. When Pryor's ready to rest, so I think we're going to see the prosecution rest. We're going to see rebuttal witnesses tomorrow. I'll go back and catch the end of that live stream, because the live stream actually went off when they emptied the courtroom, so they must have re-engaged it. So I'll go back and look at that. But my prediction is that we're going to see Pryor rest. We're going to see rebuttal witnesses tomorrow. We're going to see closing argument on Friday. And then the judge is going to give the jury the weekend off, because Monday is a holiday. It's a 3-day weekend. And I think we're going to see the jury get the case and begin deliberation on Tuesday. I don't think the judge is going to sequester the jury once they get the case. And I think that we will most certainly have a verdict by Friday. I would be very surprised if it takes more than a day of deliberation, but you never know. I've said that I think this is a very different jury from the jury for Lori, and they appear to be less emotional. And if that's the case, then I think probably we will see closings. We'll see a verdict. We might see a verdict by Wednesday. And then I think, because the judge has to sequester the jury for the penalty phase, I think he may give them a break and start the penalty phase a week from Monday. But I am unclear. I don't think that he has to sequester the jury until they're actually convened to hear the mitigation, the guilt and innocence phase. So I'd be surprised if he didn't give them some time off before the sequestration starts. So that is my crystal ball, that we'll see closing arguments and perhaps jury instructions on Friday. Tuesday, the jury will get the case, and I suspect we'll have a verdict Wednesday or Thursday, and that they won't start the penalty phase until the following Monday. Now, that's just my semi-educated guess. I could be completely wrong, and you all know I have been. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. But I think the judge, because it's a death penalty case, the judge is going to give them ample opportunity for rebuttal and also give them ample opportunity for argument. I don't think we're going to see a limitation, time limitation on argument. We didn't see it in Lori Vallow's case. I don't think we're going to see it in this one. I suspect Rob Wood is going to do the closing, because Lindsay, oh no, other way around. Rob Wood did the opening, so I expect Lindsay will do the closing. And that's good, because I think she's done an excellent job in this case. She really has been right on top of stuff. Now, I have pages of questions, and we are going to go through them. So I'm going to grab a drink. And I am going to try and get through all of these questions and answer some of tonight's questions too. Why wasn't Audrey Baratario called? Now, I think we talked about this last week. Audrey really was much more of a witness for against Lori. I don't think that what she knew about Chad was as necessary or meaningful. So I think the state just decided it wasn't going to help their case. And they really wanted to, when you are putting a case on, you don't want a shotgun pattern. You want laser guided bombs. And so I think they just decided that there wasn't anything useful that was going to come out of her testimony as it applied to Chad. What image was deleted from Tammy Daybell's phone on the night that she died? Don't you want to know? One thing that was interesting as the cast data was coming together, I'm working on a newsletter about how did the defense do, and I'm going to put this in the newsletter and really do a sort of point by point on this time, this is what happened. But I'm still sort of tweaking that. But it was really fascinating when the cast data came out about the night that Tammy died. Now, there's always been a question about whether or not this was all Chad or whether he had help. So one of the things that it becomes glaringly evident in the cast data is there's lots of text messages going back and forth between Lori and Chad, between Lori and Alex, lots of text messages going back and forth between Chad and Alex. But Alex arrives at the church 2.6 miles away from Chad Daybell's property at 10:07. At 10:22, Tammy is playing games on her phone. So she's still using her phone and it's still active at 10:22. Between 10:23 and 10:54, there's a whole flurry of 10 text messages that go back and forth between Alex and Chad. Then at 10:28, that single image is deleted. At 10:34, so half an hour later, Chad and Lori exchange text messages. There's 2 messages. So Chad to Lori, Lori back. And at 10:46, Alex Cox is back at the church and leaves. But in that gap of time between 10:54 and 11:34, when Chad texts Lori, that half-hour period, there's no communication whatsoever. So there is that gap of time when Chad and Alex were busy. And then Alex leaves the church while he's driving, and he drives to Idaho Falls, which is 20, 30 minutes away, depending on, probably more like 30 minutes away from where Alex was at Chad's, and stays in a hotel overnight. And while he's driving, he has a lengthy phone call with Lori. And he arrives at the hotel right about the time that he hangs up. And then Chad and Lori text at 12:35. So it's clear that there is a period of time, there's ample time for Alex to go to the church parking lot, leave his phone in the car, walk to Chad's, do what he's doing at Chad's, and then walk back and recover his telephone and drive out. So that's pretty telling timeline. And so we don't know what that deleted image was on Tammy Daybell's phone, but we do know that that image was deleted during that gap of time when there are no other messages going on between Lori, Chad, and Alex. The next question is, how has John Pryor been doing on his own? I think he has done a remarkable job. I have to be honest, I don't know how he's doing it. He's got one investigator who sits behind him, and I think he's got Chad keeping track of the exhibits, because he's got a laptop in front of him and he types on it. But I guarantee you he's not keeping up with his personal correspondence. He's helping out with the trial. And the place that it would make sense for him to do that would be to keep track of all the exhibits. So I have noticed just today, really, he's tired. I mean, he's having more trouble dredging stuff up out of his brain. He's having more trouble getting things mixed up. I mean, he's weary. And I think that's yet another reason why we're going to see a 3-day weekend before we really get into deliberation, because I think everybody needs it. This is an exhausting process, because for every hour that these attorneys are in court, they're spending 2 or 3 hours of preparation, and there's nowhere for that time to come from except their sleep. So I think John Pryor has done an extraordinary job without any help, but I do think that he's exhausted. He's weary. I mean, it shows in his body language. It shows in his in how quickly he's picking up on stuff. And that's just being a human being, being somebody over 50, being somebody who's burning the candle at both ends. So I have a lot of sympathy for him. I think Lindsay Blake, I've said, is doing a bang up job. She certainly has more support. I think we are going to see more of Ingrid Beatty than we have seen so far. And here's the reason why. She is from the AG's office, and here's where she really had the opportunity to shine. And that's when the challenge came to the indictment. Now, there's some questions coming up about that, so we'll get into that. But when the issue came up about the indictment, which we're going to talk about next. So I'll jump to that. Ingrid Beatty was the person who argued it. And here's why. Because she's an assistant attorney general. So she works for the AG's office, and she's got the resources of the AG's office behind her. And often they have a library of motions. So in a group of lawyers, when you have a motion on an issue, or you write a brief on an issue, you file a memo on an issue, that goes into the library because it becomes the collective wisdom of the group. It becomes the collective work product of the group. And that goes on at the Attorney General's office. So there was a good chance that the Attorney General's office had already briefed this issue or something in relation to it. So that's why they went to her, because she had that information sort of at her fingertips. She was able to take probably somebody else's brief from the office and take the 2 hours the court gave them to research the issue and go through and tweak it and update it for what they knew was going on. So some people pointed out that there is a statute that allows the court to correct a clerical error pretty much at any point in the proceeding. However, indictments are different, okay? So while it is true that the judge could correct a clerical error or a scrivener's error, a typo, it is true that in most cases a judge could do that, and judges are permitted to interpret those things liberally. That is not the case with the charging document, because indictments are different. They are the information that is given to the defendant to put them on notice that they are being charged with a crime that they have to answer for. And it is a completely different animal than a lot of the other corrections that could be made. Somebody else said, why did Boyce not bring it up earlier? And how did John Pryor not know, or did he know? Both good questions. So what generally happens is the judge is not really looking at that information, or the information in the indictment, until he is doing his analysis for a motion for acquittal, okay? So what happens then is the judge has to sit down and look at the indictment and say, and this is the test, taking the information in the light most favorable to the prosecution or the plaintiff if it's a criminal, if it's a civil case, but taking the information in the light most favorable to the prosecution, have they proven their case? Now, they don't necessarily, the judge is not necessarily going to say, I am 99.99% sure they proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge is going to say, if I presume that all of the information that the prosecutor presented is true, they've proven all of the elements of the case. The elements are, when did it happen? Where did it happen? And did they meet all of the requirements? Was it in the intentional taking of a human life if it's murder? And were there aggravating factors? So that's when the judge is really combing through the indictment. So that's the point that the judge said, wait a minute, my notes say that J.J. Vallow died on the 22nd or 23rd during that age range, but this document says 8th or 9th, which was Tylee's dates. And apparently in the corrections that were made back in January when they amended the indictment, those corrections, when whatever clerk did that, they also changed those dates. So we went through the judge's reasoning on why that he allowed that amendment, but he allowed them to amend it to read the proper dates. Did John Pritchard know? Hell yeah, he knew. But it's not his responsibility to point out to the prosecution that they've got a problem with count 4. In fact, John Pryor doesn't want them to notice until they rest, because then he can argue that case, that count, as he did, that count should be dismissed. So yes, he knew, but he does not have an obligation to bring it to the attention of the court or of the prosecution. In fact, it probably would be malpractice if he did, because that wouldn't then set it up for an appellate issue. The other question I had is Lori Vallow watching the trial? What can you see from prison? So we know that Lori had more access when she was in Madison County, which is a much smaller jurisdiction, and they're, for that reason, more relaxed. We also know that she had a lot more leeway once she was in Department of Corrections, Idaho Department of Corrections, because the rules are different than when you're pre-trial in jail. She's being held at the Maricopa County Jail. Now, Arizona, the Maricopa County has a population of somewhere around 7 million people. It is a huge jail. And I think they are more rigid about how they do things. And I also think there are a lot more people and a lot more violent offenders than Lori was exposed to. Some people said, why do you think Lori didn't want to go to jail in Arizona? It's the same reason she didn't really want to go to the Ada County Jail either. Much bigger facility, much less making exceptions for her, much less, and in the case, probably both cases, but certainly in the case in Maricopa County, exposure to a lot more violent criminals, even in the women's prison. So I don't know how much access she has, but I would suspect that she does not have a lot of internet access. Now, she does have some. She can download movies. I don't know how much access she has to the news. She probably can watch the local news. Justin Lum has been covering the Daybell case. And so I think she can get information from local news. But as far as her being able to watch a live stream, I doubt it. I think she is getting some information through her court-appointed attorneys, because I would do that if I knew that a co-defendant were on trial. So I think she's getting information that way. But I don't think that she has as much information as people think she does. I don't think that she's getting blow-by-blow information about what's going on at Chad's trial. One of the questions I got, there's three that are sort of together, so I'm going to sort of take them together. One is, do you think Chad's kids will continue to support and believe him if he's found guilty? And the other question was, do I feel sorry for Chad's kids? I feel sorry for Chad's kids for a number of reasons. And I am about to make some blanket statements about LDS, about Mormon faith. Now, Mormon belief covers not just the mainstream LDS church, but all of the 70 plus spin-offs, and I think covers Chad as well. So here's what I want to say. Chad's children were raised in a fundamental leaning, at least, mainstream church family. But I have to say this, and I know that it is going to rub perhaps some of you the wrong way, but I feel obligated to speak the truth. And here's the truth. Mormonism in general is a high demand religion. Some people say it's a cult. I'm not going to go there, but it is a high demand religion. It demands that people devote all of their energy and time to the religion, to serve their callings. And it also is a high demand religion because it has very historically and consistently attempted to control the message that that the rank and file members get. Now, that is not as easy as it used to be, thanks to the internet and the access of the accessibility of other voices. But it means that people are second and third generation of being raised in this cultural bubble. And this cultural bubble encourages helplessness and encourages submission to the patriarchy, submission to the male-dominated priesthood holders who dictate how the family is run. And it begins at the church and it goes down to the smallest unit, the family. So that is the environment that these children were brought up in, to be very isolated and in a cultural bubble, and to follow their priesthood holder. And into that, Chad has injected all of these odd beliefs. We heard at this trial that Tammy believed in the light and dark scheme and went along with Chad rating somebody 4.2 dark. Emma understood it. They were all on that same group message, talking about a specific kid in their congregation, and talking about him being a 4.2 dark. We know that Mark bought into the whole body coding thing, and that Tammy and Chad could release him from cords and weapons, and they could body code him. So, and certainly we saw with Garth's testimony that he at least had some belief in that sort of light and dark. We've heard that Chad used that to influence his kids' behavior. And if he wanted them to do something, he would then say, you know, I can't protect you. The same as he did with Lori. I can't guarantee that the shields that I put around you are going to hold if you don't do this or you don't do that. Yeah, I feel sorry for them. I feel sorry for them because they are so deep into this that I don't know that they can ever get out. And I think it is really a case of arrested development. And I do think they will continue to support Chad and will continue to support Lori going forward, even if Chad is convicted. I think that Emma is continuing to have contact with Lori and support her. And perhaps this is the only way that they can reconcile what happened to their mother. So yeah, I think they will continue to support him. It's very unfortunate. Perhaps with time, if he is sentenced to a lengthy sentence, perhaps with time, they will be able to get some perspective and perhaps break away from the control that he has over them. Will Visions of Glory spawn more of these cases? Tom Harrison should pull the book off from publication. So Tom Harrison is the subject of Visions of Glory. He dictated his near-death experiences to an author named John Pontius. John Pontius published the book. He legally had the rights to the book, not Tom Harrison. And John Pontius died not long after the book was published, and his estate currently owns the rights to the book. And it is the top-selling book in Utah. Yeah. So I doubt seriously the Pontius family is going to give up having it out there. And Tom Harrison has his own set of problems right now. He's been closely associated with Tim Ballard and also with Jody Hildebrand. So he's got his own set of problems. Did Garth die the night Tammy Daybell died? He certainly told different stories to different people. When he was asked about that, he denied it. He denied having said that he found his mom on the couch. That was something it was suggested he said to his wife. So he denied that. And then he also denied saying that he found his mother dead and his father gone. So I don't know really whether the state is going to come back and rebut some of that, or whether they're just going to let it sit with the jury and let the jury wonder whether he's telling the truth or not. Call in to question his veracity. So the next question I have is there enough to vote for death and to explain the process of the mitigation phase? So I went ahead and pulled up the Idaho statute so that I could talk about exactly what happens at the special sentencing proceeding, which is the penalty phase. So what it says is that a person convicted of murder in the first degree shall be liable for the imposition of the penalty of death if such person killed, intended killing, or acted with reckless indifference to human life, irrespective of whether such person directly committed the acts that caused the death. So that's important. It says the proceeding has to be recorded. It says a sentence of death shall not be imposed unless there's been a notice of intent to seek the death penalty, unless the jury finds beyond a reasonable doubt that at least one of the statutory aggravating factors, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is found, and that and it says the defendant shall, meaning the judge doesn't have any discretion, be sentenced to death unless mitigating circumstances are presented and found to be sufficiently compelling that the death penalty would be unjust. Now, the jury must find unanimously at least one of the aggravating factors, and they must find unanimously that as a result, the death penalty must be imposed. So it says a special sentencing proceeding shall be held promptly for the purpose of hearing all the relevant evidence and arguments in aggravation and mitigation, and that it should be the same jury, except in some exceptions that don't apply here. It also says that members of the community and the family may express their opinions, but they have to be designed to demonstrate the victim's uniqueness, and they can't characterize or express opinions about the crime or the defendant, and can't express what the appropriate sentence shall be. So they can get up and give statements about what a great person Tammy was and how sad it is that her kids have been deprived her as a mom and a grandmother, but they cannot get up and say, Chad Daybell did it and we think he's a dirty dog and we think he ought to fry. That is left up to the jury. All relevant evidence in aggravation and mitigation has to be presented, and the evidence admitted at trial will be considered and doesn't have to be repeated. So the jury will be told the following. If the jury finds that a statutory aggravating circumstance exists, which we're going to list those next, and no mitigating circumstances exist that would make the death penalty unjust, the defendant will be sentenced to the death by the court. So the judge doesn't have any discretion. If the jury says, yes, we believe that there's at least one aggravating factor, and no, we don't believe that there's anything that mitigates, then the judge must impose the death penalty. Likewise, it says, if the jury finds the existence of a statutory aggravating circumstance, but finds that the existence of mitigating circumstances makes the imposition of the death penalty unjust, then the judge must impose life without parole. So in the instance where the jury says, yes, there was an aggravating factor, but we think that imposing death would be unjust, the judge has to impose life without parole. So the next thing is, if the jury were to find that there have been no aggravating factors, which would be unusual if he's already been found guilty, but if they find that there are no aggravating factors, then the judge must impose life with possible parole after 10 years. Now, I think that is a very, very remote possibility. With regard to each of the statutory aggravating circumstances, the jury has to return a special verdict identifying which of those aggravating factors apply. So let's talk about the aggravating factors. At least one of these aggravating factors must be found beyond a reasonable doubt by a unanimous jury. The first one is that the defendant was previously convicted of another murder. Well, that doesn't apply here because he's not previously been convicted. It would apply in Lori Vallow's case, except that in Arizona, conspiracy to commit murder is not a death penalty offense. It is here in Idaho. At the time the murder was committed, the defendant also committed another murder. So that is going to depend on how they define at the time of the murder. If they're saying it was all one course of conduct, it's possible they could say that at the time the murder was committed, the defendant also committed another murder. But I think there's a question about that. So the defendant knowingly created a great risk of death to many persons. That would be like more like a terrorism kind of a situation. Excuse me. Okay. The next one is the murder was committed for remuneration or the promise of remuneration, or the defendant employed another to commit the murder for money. Remuneration, which is a hard word to say, is money. So that applies here because of the theft. That was the whole reason why the state went after them for all the theft as well. So proving the theft, it proves an aggravating factor. The murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, manifesting exceptional depravity. I think this is the one they're going to hang their hat on. Clearly, we know the condition of Tylee's body. We also have testimony from the medical examiner that JJ was suffocated by a plastic bag being put over his head. Sorry, allergy drugs wearing off. And I think that the jury could find that that was particularly depraved, atrocious, or cruel. By the murder or circumstances surrounding its commission, the defendant exhibited utter disregard for human life. So I think that's another one that they can find, yes, that was the case. Now, there is an additional aggravating factor that I don't think applies, and that's a murder committed in the perpetration or attempt to perpetrate arson, rape, robbery, burglary, kidnapping, or mayhem, and the defendant killed, intended a killing, or acted with reckless indifference to life. This is the situation where somebody goes in to rob a convenience store and kills the clerk, or someone sets a fire and someone dies as a result of the arson. There's a number of those. Robbery and burglary do not apply here. Burglary is breaking into someone's residence for the purpose of stealing things, and robbery is taking someone else's property by force. Neither one of those things happens, so that one does not apply. So the last one is the action exhibited that the defendant has a propensity to commit murder and would be a continuing threat to society. I think that's a maybe. They might find that one. And then the last one is if the murder is committed against a peace officer, a government executive officer, an officer of the court, or a prosecutor or judge. So those don't apply. So I think the aggravating factors that the jury is going to have to look at are going to be the committed for remuneration, especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, manifesting exceptional depravity, having utter disregard for human life, and potentially exhibited propensity for killing, and would be a continuing danger to society. So that is the death penalty mitigation phase in a nutshell. Will John Pryor recall Melanie Pulaski or Melanie Gibb? No, he'd already released them both. And we know that he's going to rest tomorrow. We talked about death versus life without parole. What is the most persuasive evidence, and what is the most persuasive evidence? And do Mel Gibb and Mel P and Zulema know more? Wow. I'm not sure that there is one particular piece of evidence that is, I would say, is the most persuasive, but I think that the prosecution have put together a very persuasive circumstantial case. I think they have connected the dots and filled in the puzzle to the point where the jury is going to say, yeah, that dark spot's definitely a cow. If you don't know what I'm talking about, see last week's discussion about circumstantial evidence and whether you can put the puzzle together. What is the weakest part of the case? Weakest part of the defense case? Well, I think the defense basically is having to poke holes and try and cause reasonable doubt. And I don't know that he's done enough. As far as the prosecution goes, I think the weakest link in the case is the actual connection to each of them being hands-on. Now, the conspiracy charges, I think they've got hands down. But I think it's going to be a little bit more of a circumstantial leap for the jury to get to the murder charges. And the weakest one, I think, is Tammy's. Not to say that I don't think they've proven it, because I think they have. I think the CAS data proves it. In spite of the fact that Chad turned his phone off and Alex left his in his car at the church, I think the lack of evidence speaks volumes there. How does a person murder someone by pulmonary embolism, and could it have been malachite? My understanding is that is not a symptom of malachite, although my understanding is there are toxins that can cause pulmonary embolisms. But I'm not a medical expert. It is not my understanding that malachite can cause that. And it's also my understanding that it takes a great deal of malachite for it to be toxic. And the people who get malachite toxicity are usually people who are working with malachite, cutting it so that it is in the air, the dust, and breathing in the dust. I have heard people say that there is a toxin created by the puffer fish that can cause it. But I don't know that that was explored during the case. How does the jury deal with impeachment? And we talked about impeachment. So using evidence to say what you said before wasn't true. So going back and using somebody's grand jury testimony, we're seeing a lot of impeachment in the Karen Reed trial, if you're following that. I've been trying to catch bits and pieces of it, and we're seeing a lot of impeachment where they're using prior grand jury testimony, prior testimony in other proceedings to show that the person's not being truthful. So what the jury will get is an instruction that says, if you find this person lied, you can assume they've lied about other parts of their testimony. So that is the reason why impeachment testimony is very important, because they will get that if you find this person is not truthful in part, you can find that they are that all of their testimony was not truthful. Why wasn't the jury told about the status of Chad Daybell's current wife, that Lori has already been convicted? That's a good question. It is, I am certain that it was the subject of a pre-trial evidentiary ruling on a motion in limine, and that is because of Rule 401, which says that evidence even relevant evidence cannot be introduced if it is more prejudicial than probative. So in that case, I think it would be easy for a jury to jump to the conclusion that, well, she's already been convicted, so he must be guilty. And that is exactly what you don't want a jury to do. You want a jury to convict on the merits of the evidence, and not on, well, if she's already guilty, he must be. So that is why that wasn't allowed in. And we just have a couple more here. Why will John Pryor write a book? And is that Chad Daybell profiting? Interesting question. If John Pryor were to write a book, he would face some obstacles in writing about a case where he represented someone, because he owes a duty of confidentiality to Chad. And as Kurt Nurmi found out, even getting your client to waive at least some portions of the confidentiality obligation doesn't relieve you of it, and he was disbarred. So I don't see John Pryor writing a book about this case until he's ready not to practice anymore. Would that be Chad Daybell profiting? Only if John Pryor said, I will write a book and I will relieve you of any obligation for your attorney fees in return for you waiving your confidentiality your right to confidentiality. So that would be tricky, because then at that point it would be Chad Daybell profiting. If any amount of proceeds from a potential book were to go to offset Chad's attorney fees, then he wouldn't be able to do it. It would be precluded by the Slayer statutes. Does John Pryor have it in for Rob Wood? I think they're not friendly. And I think that goes back to Pryor feeling, right or wrong, that Rob Wood was involved in some misconduct and should have recused himself and didn't. We don't know the details of that because they're all still sealed, but I can assure you I'm going to be looking to get them once they're not sealed anymore. And this is the final question for this group of questions, and then we'll see what we can get to out of the chat. I'm running out of steam and losing my voice. Will John Pryor handle the appeal? Absolutely not. Appellate lawyers are lawyers who handle appeals are a very specialized kind of practicing law. They are not trial attorneys, and they have very different skill sets. So as with Lori Vallow, what will happen, because Chad is indigent, is that a state court-appointed appellate attorney will be appointed and will be somebody who is certified to handle death penalty appeals. So, good questions. Let's see if we have any different questions in the chat. We have just a few minutes left before we're going to wrap up. So, these are all really good questions, though. You guys are asking for some good information. Looks like Jen's working on coming up with some questions. Hi, Greg W. Do you think the prosecutors are going to bring out some Chad and Emma calls for rebuttal? Possibly. Possibly. There might be some Chad and Emma jail calls. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know for sure whether that would really help the prosecution much more to bring out those jail calls. Could very well discredit Emma, and that might make jurors think twice about feeling sorry for the kids and believing Emma. It's possible, I think. I'm trying to think through that as I'm thinking on the fly, and my brain's getting tired. Yeah, I think it's possible that there are Chad and Emma jail calls that could be used to disprove her some of the things that she said in her testimony. If they've got calls that directly contradict something she said, then it would be worth bringing them in. So that's a good question. Emma implicated herself in covering up the burials with the wind direction search. That is why she didn't ask questions, because she knew. Chad said his kids know how to keep secrets. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree that they had some that they've had some part in it. I think that Emma lied, and that Chad did that search, that it wasn't Emma. I can't see Chad telling his children, I buried Lori's kids in the backyard. I can't see him doing that. For so many reasons, but I can't see him doing that. I mean, if there were an instance where the kids found out, or the kids overheard something, then I could see them knowing, but I couldn't see Chad just out and out telling them and implicating them. So I think the truth is that Emma lied about being the one that did the search. Hey, Trisha the trucker, you're in Nashville. I hope you're still going to be in Nashville in a week or so, or that you're going to be back in Nashville by then. Hi from Nashville. I'm confused about the funeral home. Was it the Idaho or the Utah funeral home that could only hold Tammy's funeral on Tuesday or Saturday? And if it was the Idaho one, ? Yeah, they weren't very clear about that. But from the beginning, Chad wanted Tammy's funeral in Springville. So that's Utah. So I took it to say that when, because that was the funeral director guy that came to Chad's house and met with them. He was from the Utah funeral home. I took it to mean that they were told it could only happen Saturday or Monday, or Tuesday, which would have been the day the funeral was on, or not till the following Saturday. I don't think that's true, because I don't think that the funeral director. The funeral director was asked specifically those questions, and he said Chad was in a really big hurry to have the service. He certainly didn't say if we couldn't do it Tuesday, then we had to wait till Saturday. That was never suggested in his testimony. So I'm not sure that it's true. I think that's another area where Emma and Garth have got their stories straight. At the Idaho, my understanding is that the Idaho funeral home was responsible for picking Tammy's body up and doing the embalming right away. And then the Utah funeral home came the next day and picked her up. So that's the way I understood that it happened. So good question, Trisha. Kelly J. Has Lori tried to appeal her Idaho case? I don't remember hearing anything about it. She has. Her attorneys very promptly filed the notices of appeal. Here's what has been holding it up, and I'm not even sure that it's actually done now. The appellate court goes off of the trial court's transcript. They want a written transcript of the trial court's proceedings. So a court reporter has to transcribe that entire 6-week hearing. It's a huge job. The last time I looked at the court's docket, the clerk had once again requested an extension on getting the transcript done. Until the transcript is certified and filed, the appeal doesn't really start. So they really need to, not much can happen until then. So the appeal's just sort of sitting there churning while they're waiting for that transcript to be certified. Once that happens, then the defense will file an opening briefs with all of the reasons why they think they are entitled to appeal. And the state, usually it's an appellate attorney at the Attorney General's office, will answer that opening brief. They file a brief, and then the court can opt to hear oral arguments on it. And generally in death penalty cases, they do. They skip the appeals court and go directly to the Idaho Supreme Court on death penalty cases. But since Lori's case is not a death penalty case, her case would first have to go to the appellate level and then to the Supreme Court if they affirm her conviction. So, good questions. Let's take two more. Christine Gray, do you think John Pritchard, I have a very dear friend, this tells you how tired I'm getting. I have a very dear friend who I practiced with for years, whose name is John Pritchard, and we all called him JP. So every time I see JP, I think, John, what are they asking about John for? Do I think that John Pryor really thinks Chad is innocent or is just doing his job? You know, I really don't know. I certainly got the impression in some of the early hearings that John Pryor believed that Chad was innocent, that he didn't have a hand in the actual deaths of the three people who died. Having seen all the evidence, I don't know. I think it's harder, having seen all of the evidence at trial, to suggest that Chad Daybell's innocent. So hard to say. I think maybe John Pryor started out believing that, and I think maybe he's come around to, you're going to prison, which happens sometimes too. You know, once the lawyer has all of the discovery and digs into the investigation, it gets harder. So, last question. While Jen is putting that question up, is Judge Boyce any friendlier to me these days? Nah, never going to happen. And he's going to be really unfriendly once I get all those sealed documents. So no, I'm not holding my breath, but thanks for asking. I want to just remind everybody that I am going to do my best to get a newsletter out that covers the defense. Now that we know the defense is going to rest, I'm going to finish that up. So if you are subscribed to the newsletter, you'll get a bit of a deep dive into the defense coming up. And I also want to remind everybody that we are still taking squares if you want to make a quilt square for Kay and Larry. We're going to continue to pursue that project after Chad's trial and after I get my move done. The pattern is listed in our show notes, and it is a folded crane pattern, foundation pieced. It finishes at 6 inches. You can use any focus fabric for the crane. Please put them on a black background. I'd love to get more, and we're going to make them a nice lap size quilt in memory of JJ. So I want to say thanks so much. We've got we have 499 people in chat tonight, almost 500. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I appreciate it. I know that you all enjoy it because you ask great questions and you're focused on the important legal questions at hand. So I want to thank everybody for being here. Thanks as always to Jen, who does a wonderful job, and I appreciate beyond belief. And at the moderator wheel. And thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for everybody who's pre-ordered the book. If you haven't, please consider doing that. And for those of you who are going to CrimeCon, I'll see you in a week. So once again, thanks everybody, and good night.